from chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. It's the wasp. That is the poem of praise of the woman from head to foot. And here's how it goes. How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats that have descended from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn ewes, all of which have come up from their washing, all of which bear twins, and no one among them has lost her young. Your lips are like a scarlet thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your temples are like a slice of a pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with rows of stones, on which are hung 1,000 shields, all the round shields of the mighty men. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle, which feed among the lilies. Until the cool of the day, when the shadows flee away, I will go my way to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. You are altogether beautiful, my darling, and there is no blemish in you. All right. Last week, we focused on the metaphor for this, on the idea that just as the woman is beautiful to her lover, so we are beautiful to God. And we talked about that. And so we looked at the spiritual implications behind this physical picture. But today I want to look just a little bit at this physical picture. I want to look at the implications of this passage for human romance, for human love. And the first thing I want to point out about this is that it says that there's something about human love at its best that says that when we love one another, we find each other beautiful, and we say so, we express it. Part of human romance is that the man says to the woman, you are altogether beautiful. I see no blemish in you. I love you exactly as you are from head to foot. He calls out her beauty, and he affirms it, and he says, for me, it is without blemish. And later in another passage, she does the same thing back to him. So there's something about the experience of being in love, which I think God is designed to be a place where we feel really beautiful in the eyes of somebody else, and where we express that to one another, where I'm willing to say to my wife, you are the most beautiful of all to me, and mean it, and know that it's true, and she's willing to say the same thing back to me. And I think this shows that God has designed us emotionally so that in a good romance, we will see ourselves as physically desirable. We'll see ourselves as desirable through the eyes of our spouse, and we'll accept that is how we are made. And that's because it's real. It's not just pretend. It's not the man pretending to find the woman beautiful or the woman pretending later to find the man attractive. It's something that's genuine. It's based on the fact that God has built into us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made as physical creatures. And so we need to have a biblical perspective on the beauty and the wonderfulness of the human body. It's kind of funny. Satan has gone in two directions in the last 40 years since the sexual revolution of the 60s. On the one hand, he's tried to get the world to say that the physical body is all that matters and that any kind of physical desire should be satisfied no matter what it is. And that makes life real and vital and alive. But at the same time, beneath that, he's tried to convince people that they are physically disgusting, that they're not what they're supposed to be, they're not who they're supposed to be, and that they need to constantly be working to make sure to present themselves in the best way possible. And we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We just are. And that's physical as well as spiritual. And the biblical perspective is that there is beauty to the physical body, and that is there for us to enjoy in a biblically sanctioned love between a husband and a wife. It's there for us to enjoy, and it's real. And but there is something in us that we have trouble believing that about ourselves. We have trouble seeing even our physical forms as really being beautiful. We're conscious of all the ways in which we don't live up to the standards that the world gives us. We're insecure about everything. And that's a product of the fall. I mean, Adam and Eve, it was only after they became conscious of sin that they also became conscious that they were naked and wanted to hide themselves. But that same thing is being played through all the time now. We're in a world in which we feel completely insecure about our own bodies and about our own beauty and attractiveness. And Satan, on the one hand, tells us to go overboard and make it all about sex. But then on the other hand, he tells us that we are disgusting and should be ashamed of who we are in terms of how God has created us. And neither of those is the biblical approach. So I think we need to be really clear from the beginning here. Well, actually, let me say a little bit more about that. Satan does this thing He's been doing it for a while. He gets the whole world to go way out of balance on one area. And whenever that happens, look, you'll find that he's got another group of people, or maybe the same group of people in another way, going just as far out of balance in the other extreme. In 1 Corinthians 6 and 5 and 6, you see a church which has gone way out of balance on sexual immorality. And then in 1 Corinthians 7, you see evidence that there were also people in that church who were not only trying to be pure, but had decided that maybe marriage as a whole should be banned. There should just be no contact between men and women. And so wherever Satan pushes society way out of balance in one direction, he'll tend to create a counter reaction that's way out of balance in the other. So in the same way that our society is all about sexual promiscuity, there's also a kind of a fear and a dread of physicality that comes in right along with it on the other side as kind of an overreaction to it. And Satan loves to catch us going both directions. So this has happened, for example, with self-esteem. In the 60s, there began a big push in our world to say we need to tell everybody that they should have self-esteem. They should feel good about themselves, and that will solve everything. It'll solve crime, it'll solve poverty, everything will be fixed because everybody will have good self-esteem. And we tried that and it didn't work. But the funny thing is that doesn't mean that self-esteem doesn't matter. In fact, what we see now is that people are more insecure about self-esteem than they've ever been before. People feel worse about themselves than they ever did before. So Satan has said self-esteem is everything at the same time with one hand and said, believe in yourself. At the same time as with the other, he's taken away everybody's confidence about who they were, and people feel worse than ever about themselves. So if we come along and say, forget self-esteem, you should realize we're all rotten, that's not helping. But the problem is that both sides are wrong. What we need to do is say self-esteem needs to be balanced and it needs to be found in God. The same thing happens with his assault in the last 40 years, I think, on physical beauty and sexuality and gender. Satan is going way out of balance on one side, but then at the same time, he's trying to create insecurity and doubt and worries and sort of a sense of disgust with people about who they are physically. So the world is saying, so here's what I want to talk about here. We have this desire for people to find us beautiful, or at least for one person to find us beautiful. But that desire can be met because we are beautiful, because we are fearfully and wonderfully made, because God has designed us physically as well as spiritually, and we're in the image of God, and there's something beautiful about the way he's designed us, and we need to believe that. So what happens in the meantime is that the world comes along to people and says, you must conform to our arbitrary standards. You have to look like us. You have to look like a supermodel. You have to Photoshop yourself so that you're always young and beautiful in a certain way, certain standard of beauty. You have to look exactly the way we think you should. You have to feel the way we think you should. You have to have all the different kinds of experience we think you should. And if you don't do that, you're not a good enough human. So the world has these arbitrary standards of beauty that it squeezes people in. But Satan comes along and he says, all right, on the one hand, tell everyone you're perfect and they have to accept you as you are. But on the other hand, at the exact same time, he's saying inside, know that you're disgusting. That's kind of what he's doing to people. And what God says is, look, you're fearfully and wonderfully made. You don't need to go around and tell everybody, but you certainly need to be within biblical bounds as far as sexuality and sex within marriage and not elsewhere, and modesty and all those different kinds of things are important. But you're still fearfully and wonderfully made. All right, so God's answer is to say this: you formed my inward parts, we would say. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. This is talking, notice, about not only the mental and the spiritual aspect of our creation, but the physical. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. Indeed, if I think about it, I know that I'm wonderfully made. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance. God knows everything we are and all that we are. In my day, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. You're fearfully and wonderfully made. So let's think about this. Even if I'm aging, yes. The world says you have to look young, you have to be young, you have to get plastic surgery, you have to do whatever else you can to maintain your youth, because once you start to age, you're losing it. But God says, A gray head is the crown of glory, Proverbs 16:31. It's found in the way of righteousness. The glory of young men is their strength. The honor of old men is their gray hair. There's something beautiful about the aging process. My physical body may be wearing out. I may be less healthy or less strong than I used to be. And in one sense, the world says, well, there's no value to that. But God says that gray head, that's a sign of my work in your life. It's a sign of the experience you've had. It's the sign of the things you've learned. And it is a great beauty. And there are people, I think, as we focus on our walk with God and our becoming closer and closer to Him, there's a great beauty to aging, and we don't have to be afraid of it, and we don't have to be ashamed of being older. So yes, even if I'm aging, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Even if I'm disabled, um, and the answer, of course, is yes, of course, even if you're disabled. Um, It reminds me of John 9. There's this man who was born blind. And as he passed by, it says he saw a man blind from birth. Jesus' disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he be born blind? That's so interesting. Here's this man who's been born blind. That's a tragedy because he can't see, and he loses something that the rest of us have. But it does not at all mean that he's less of a person. And what's the first thing that the world around him jumps to, that even his disciples jump to? Must be that he sinned, or must be that his parents sinned. Somehow it makes him less right with God to have this issue. And in the same way, the world looks at us if we have any kind of disability or any kind of impairment or any kind of thing that makes us different than the norm and says something must be wrong with you. And Jesus said it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents. It was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. God had plans for him. God is using him and even his disability for good. The world says only the physically perfect are beautiful. This man must have done something wrong. But Jesus says, on the contrary, this is for the glory of God. Jacob was wrestled with God in Genesis 32. And at the end of that time, he was struck on the hip by the angel of God. And as a result, he was limping, maybe for the rest of his life, but certainly for a while, because his hip was dislocated. And it says, therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel don't eat the sinew of the hip, which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh and the sinew of the hip. In other words, for them, this limp, this disability became a sign of the sacred. It became a sign of the touch of God. And so even something like a limp, which is a kind of a disability, and it came out of Jacob's own stubbornness in a way at first, that's something that became a mark of the touch of God and became a valuable and wonderful thing. Even you might say, if I'm confused about sexuality and gender, that the generation today, people are growing up being constantly assaulted with and assailed with questions about, are you sure you're a man? Are you sure you're a woman? Are you sure you think the way a man's supposed to think, or feel the way a man's supposed to feel, or think the way a woman's supposed to think, or feel the way a woman's supposed to feel? And we're constantly being asked to question. People are constantly being asked to question their femininity, their masculinity, their role, their sexual identity, and to ask, maybe you've got it wrong, maybe you need to change something, maybe something else is wrong. And underlying that is the sense that there's something sort of wrong the way I am, something sort of freakish the way I am, that I'm not meant to be the way I am to be. Well, we can debate the theology of all that stuff at some other time. But as far as whatever you might be wondering about, your masculinity, your femininity, your gender, your sexual orientation, your sexual desires, whether you're binary, non-binary, any about that, the way you were created by God, I will say this, the way you're created by God is fearfully and wonderfully made. And there's nothing to be ashamed of, or nothing to feel like has to be different. Now, your choices and how you act, that's another question. But the way that the things that are unchangeable about you, the things that are built in, baked into your personality, that's fearfully and wonderfully made. And so again, the world wants you to conform. So the answer again is that even if I'm confused about sexuality and gender, yes, you're still fearfully and wonderfully made. The world wants to make you conform to its own arbitrary standards of what being a man or woman is. Satan wants to make you feel disgusted with who you currently are as a man or woman or whatever you think is going on. But God has made you in his image. Whatever's going on with all that, it's beautiful, and you're fearfully and wonderfully made. So remember, you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And remember, you are altogether beautiful, my darling, says the man. There's no blemish in you. There are things we can do or not do which are good or wrong. But as far as what God has created us with, as far as the person he's made us to be from whom we start, that part of the creation of God is wonderful and beautiful, and we have nothing to be afraid of. And don't let Satan tell you otherwise. Don't let the world tell you otherwise. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise about that. Okay, hopefully that makes sense and you understand it balanced in the context of everything else. And next week, we're going to move on to the next passage.